Good afternoon, everybody. How you doing? This is your Coach Renz, and on this video, we're going to discuss the point of the male sacrifice and why that became the religious dogma of the day, and how we go back to the ancients and have a clearer understanding of what is really meant by the male blood sacrifice compared to the female blood sacrifice, and how we can, create within ourselves the only sacrifice that's necessary, which does not involve death. All right, so just jump right into this one, because I'm not going to make this a long video. Hopefully, to jump right into it, we got to first understand where this nonsense comes from with the male sacrifice having to die. Now, there are many different pathways of understanding that you can go in order to figure this out. One of those pathways is to understand right off the bat how societies became around 8,000 years ago. The oldest writings, the majority of the oldest writings we can find, the oldest hieroglyphics we can find, something happened where the male dominance began to be implemented. When man first looked at nature, it was the Mother Earth, right? When man first looked at the stars, it was the sun and it was the moon. The sun representing male, the moon representing the female. Now, the sun was thought to die every day, whereas the moon went in cycles, right? Now, somewhere along the line, around 8,000 years ago, we began to put the woman down. We lost the female. The story of Adam and Eve really can be looked at as not the losing of that women sin, as far as like women period, because you had people like church fathers like, I can't think of his name, Tertullian, who said that women were the gateway of Satan, the gateway of hell, who put women down. There were others who said that women cannot be considered man, that they were subhuman to man. They put women down and try to keep women, in a box of shame. But what we realize is that at the same time they tried to do this, they respected women. Women did something that man can't do. Women presented something that man tried to emulate, but wasn't able to quite do it. So before I get into that aspect of it, let's break it down a little bit. Now, some of the oldest writings that we have come from the Sumerians. The Sumerians tell us that you had you had Apsu, and he had his sister, and they created everything. All right, and through him and his sister, everything was created. The Greeks talk about chaos and Gaia, but creating everything. So there's always a male and female in the fullness of creation, but the male seemed to have taken a dominant role, and it's always been the king, and who is the one who makes the decision, who is the dominant force. And even when we look at Enki and Enlil, one of the things that you have to look at is that they created, these are men who were always fighting for power, and it was always male dominant. But once they started creating man, once they started creating man, what did Enki first utilize? He utilized the hominid woman. The hominid woman's eggs were utilized with the male sperm of the Anunnaki to create the next level of man. And then they used another woman to create the next level of man, and then the next woman to create the next level of man. So it was always the woman to create the birth of the next man. Now, I can go deep into the name Eve, and I can go into where it comes from and how the Hebrews have taken the goddess Ashura and made her into Hawa. I can't even say the name. Hawa sound. It's Hawwa with line over top H, and that it became the Aramaic name for the woman, which became Eve, which means the source of life, right? So Eve was the source of life, taken from the Sumerians, because the source of life for man came from the Anunnaki utilizing the female egg, right? So they knew this Anunnaki story, and that was incorporated into the Hebrew story around 2,300 years ago. Now the Anunnaki story is like 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. So it's a huge time difference. In every other culture, It has always been the Mother Earth who gave birth. Why? Because the female creates life. The female is the only entity on the planet that can create life. Men do not birth a child. We cannot birth anything. We cannot deliver a child. And for some of you, you already know where I'm going, but we can't birth a child. But it's a little bit deeper, because man has always been fascinated by something else. Because why the blood sacrifice? If it's just about birthing, well, all birth, if you ever experienced a childbirth, then you know a few things happen. When the child is in the womb, when the child gets ready to come out, there's blood. There's a lot of blood. When the child comes out, boom, you got a child. And the child comes out as part with the blood, and it has to be cleaned off. Then the placenta is there, and it has blood in it, and which that placenta has been utilized for many different holy rituals throughout multiple cultures. So the female gives this blood to create the child, but the female doesn't die. Sure, there's birth mortality rates were high in certain conditions, certain areas, but the female gave this blood, and most of the time they didn't die. The male does not give any blood and does not die. Now there's another thing that happens. The female has a menstrual cycle. She bleeds for 3 to 5 days and she does not die. Men cannot bleed for 3 to 5 days without dying, right? We will die in 3 to 5 days. This is why the cup, the chalice, because women will bleed from their uterus, their cup, right? The ovaries and the cup, and it flows down. But men, we don't have that ability. We don't, we don't bleed from our penis unless we have a circumcision representing the covenant, right? There's blood during the circumcision, so we are making the blood covenant by bleeding from our genitalia like a woman would. Men are trying to emulate the woman. But then as you move forward, you got the cup. Yeshua says that in the cup is my blood, and the bread is my body, that you got to drink it as a representation of your commitment. But it is the same symbology of the uterus, or if you go back to the Egyptian, to the Ankh, right? The uterus, ovaries, vaginal, everlasting life is what it represents and what it means. So this is what the Egyptians had as the representation of everlasting life. And you'll see this on many hieroglyphs, right? So man has always been fascinated that a woman can bleed for 3 days and not die. Whereas a man cannot bleed for 3 to 5 days without dying. A man will die if he bleeds consistently for 3 to 5 days. So the only way to emulate that was man had to give his life and die. Now this is also astrological. The woman represented by the moon does not die in her every night. She cycles. She gets bigger into a full moon and then goes down into a no moon, right? Just like a woman's cycle, she has a cycle of menstrual, and then then the menstrual cycle starts, and 3 to 5 days is over. Just like the moon has a no moon for a few days, and then it's over, and it comes back. So the woman cycles without dying, whereas the sun dies, right? I told you guys in another video when we was talking about Horus and the winter solstice, how the sun sets south every day. Days are getting shorter, and it's setting south, and then on December 21st, it sets and dies on the solar cross, right? And then for 3 days, it sets in the same spot. And then on December 25th, it then starts to rise. On that day, the December 25th, now it rises a little bit north, and it sets a little bit north, 1 degree, and it keeps on. Now the days are growing, it's getting strong, so the sun is reborn. So it had to die in order to give life. Because once the sun starts having longer days, then we know spring is coming. So by the time we get to the spring equinox, then spring is in full bloom. So and then the sun has fully conquered death, so it brings back new life. So whereas a woman can just have a baby through her cycles and create life, the only way man could create life was through the death of the sun and the rebirth coming later in the resurrection, which is why Horus had to be resurrected, and Mithra had to be resurrected, and Jesus was resurrected, and Dionysus was resurrected, and Atticus was resurrected, and everybody else, and Krishna resurrected. Everybody had to be resurrected because they had to die and be resurrected. Men had to be. Only Ishtar is the only female that I can think of right now who died and was resurrected. But every other time it's a male. Odin died on the tree. The Allfather, Odin, died on the tree, sacrificed himself, and then was resurrected. So every male, the male has to go through death and resurrection, because the son goes through death and resurrection, because we're trying to emulate the creation, the birth, the process of giving life of the female through her menstrual cycle. And that's what man is trying to copy. And the cup symbolizes that, because it's symbolizing the uterus, the ovaries, and the vaginal tract, which we also have in the Ankh for the Egyptian, in Egyptian culture. So that's the idea. Now, it all became male-centric, right? For that dying of the sun, and men had to be dominant, so we get rid of the female. Now, before I go into this last little part, what I want to quickly hit upon is that in other cultures, certain cultures, that practice sex magic, what they realize is that the seed of the man carries a little bit of blood in it. So in the sex magic practices, then man doesn't have to die, but utilizes his seed, which is why you'll find in some of the Gnostic Gospels, it talks about the seed of a man not touching the floor, not falling or not being wasted, that seed of the man has to be implemented into the woman. Or if you're practicing sex magic, that seed has to be spread over the sigil or the altar or whatever it is, but it has to be there, because that is representing that blood sacrifice of birth, of creation, that's why it's called the seed. And within each sperm there is blood. So for the groups, the people who understand sex magic, that is the purpose. And that's why I think it's the Secret Writings of James that talks about the seed of a man not hitting the floor, that is a sin. And that is also why I think in some Old Testament books that's not part of the Torah, it talks about how a man masturbating and his seed hitting the ground was a sin. And this is also why we have the no masturbations and all that kind of stuff. This is why the church got into men not masturbating. But the church also had to shut down a bunch of other things, because it was widely accepted for hundreds of years that the menstrual blood of a woman was powerful, that it was to be worshipped, utilized. The menstrual blood of women was spread over fields for fertilization. It was spread over houses for safety, for growing of families. That there were time frames where women would take other virgins' menstrual blood and barren women would ingest it in order for them to utilize that in magical purposes. And these were Christians and Muslims and everybody else. So you got to go back and look into the ancient parts of people, of cultures, and see this. And not just them, it was Aboriginals and Native Americans. Many cultures practice these types of things in order to bring about fertility and life, because that's what it was all about. It was about bringing back life. And men had to copy the woman, so we had to have the male sacrifice. And since we saw it in the stars, we had to copy it definitely, because that's what it was all about. Now, what does this really tell us? How do we implement? What do we need to recognize so that we begin to utilize this in our daily? You see, in our daily, it all goes back to two things. Well, one thing really, but I'm going to separate them. It all goes back to raising the feminine energy. The story of Adam and Eve is about the feminine energy falling. The reason why the serpent and Dante, when Dante did his serpent, Dante did the devil, and the devil had a tail, because Dante, even though he was a little bit delusional, but Dante still understood that it was the falling of the female. So the devil had to have a tail, which represents the female serpent. Now, as a matter of fact, the name Eve in the Hebrew is slightly different than the word snake in the ancient Hebrew. So just check that out. So that they're very slightly different. So, but we talk about raising the Kundalini. It's raising the female energy. It's about getting that female energy back up. Like, so many men are so egotistical and they're ruled by ego. So many men can't deal with their emotions. So many men don't show any emotion and try and believe that the hardness of a man is what makes you a man. And we commit to wars, we commit to strife, starvation, we commit to greed and all these kind of things, because we have not raised the feminine energy. And the feminine energy of the earth has to be raised as well. But we haven't raised that feminine energy so that we're working in concert with one another. This is why the symbol of medicine, the symbol of health, is the caduceus with the two serpents coming up to a point of the crown. So we have to raise that female energy in order for it. And one of those was symbolized by the death of the male. See, the death of the ego and then the rebirth of the ego in concert with the feminine energy gives us what the Hermetics teach as the law of gender, which is that in order to create anything, we must have male and female energy. In order for anything to live in balance, it must have a balance of male and female energy. That it must be a balance of the ego and the emotion. That it must be, a balance of logic and care. That those things must be in balance and working with one another in order for us to truly find peace first within ourselves, then within our circle, and then the larger circles as they continue to grow of our world and our universe. And that is what is lost, what was lost about 8,000 years ago, when the male psyche, the male energy started to be so dominant. You have to remember, back in the days of Egypt, they had priests and priestesses. Back in the days of the Druids, they had priests and priestesses. In the Native American, they have shamans who are men and women. All other cultures had their religious leaders were both male and female. Even the Christians started out right with the fact that priests had to be married. In the ancient Jewish, the rabbi had to be married. So when you look at Yeshua and you say that they call him rabbi or master, he had to be married, which is why Mary Magdalene and the Holy Grail is her uterus and carrying the bloodline. But carrying the bloodline, sorry, I had a phone call for an interruption there. And Dan Brown hits on this in his Da Vinci Code, but it is a true thing. And a lot of things are added to that one. That's just added stuff. But the concept is there. In every fantasy, there is some bit of truth. So, but that female bloodline, that the chalice, the female uterus holding the blood, So in order for Yeshua to have been considered a rabbi, if you believe he existed, then he had to have had a wife. And that would have been Mary Magdalene, which is why in one gospel it says that he kissed her often on the lips, right? But that she was his favorite. And that's why Da Vinci painted her within the Last Supper and all these other different things that people recognize that you got to have both. But at the end of the day, is whether he existed or not, it is the combination of the male and female energy. Him representing the male, her representing the female, coming together as one. And that's something, the alchemical marriage, that we have to have within ourselves in order for us to be able to function at the higher states of consciousness. You see, you can't just be totally male and devoid of female, nor can you be all female and devoid of male. You have to have that balance between the two, and that's what it's trying to teach you. The male sacrifice is one, we're trying to emulate the female so that we can have, well, it's been can't think of the word, but it's been taken hostage. It's been corrupted by traditional religion to put down the woman and raise up just the male, and that the woman can only be sanctified through just the male. That any and all people have to be sanctified only through the male, can only be saved through the male. Whereas it is actually the combination of the two that brings about personal salvation, which only happens inside you, not outside of you, because nothing can happen outside of you without it happening inside of you first. So you have to come to that realization that you need both balance of male and female, the raising of the Kundalini. This is where meditation comes into place. This is where study and the trivium of understanding knowledge and wisdom and getting knowledge, having understanding, and then implementing that as wisdom. And as you start experiencing that, you start to realize how they work in concert with one another for you to have that kind of life that you want to have. So meditation is very helpful. Study is incredibly helpful. And then for you just to have accurate thinking is the most helpful. The more you accurately think concerning every aspect of life, metaphysical and physical, then the better off you'll be. The higher your consciousness rises. Like, many people will look at this video, and then when I talked about Egypt, they're gonna be like, that's right, they stole it from Egypt. Or when I talk about Sumerians and all this kind of stuff, and it becomes black, it becomes white, it becomes male, it becomes female. Where as long as your mindset is there, then your consciousness is still low. So in order for you to raise your consciousness, to raise your kundalini, you have to let go of all these labels. I forgot the guy's name, but he said it so perfectly. Is the fact that when you label me, you negate me. Because as soon as you label me, now I have to begin to live up to those labels. And I will start doing things to make sure I live up to the label of being a black man, live up to the label of being a man, live up to the label of being an American, live up to the label of being whatever. But instead of just living up to the one label, and that is that I'm a spiritual being that is part of the Creator, plain and simple. And coming to that understanding. It doesn't matter if you're black or white or green or purple. It doesn't matter what gender you are or anything like that. You treat me with kindness, I treat you with kindness. But I'm going to treat you with kindness no matter what. I'm going to treat you fairly no matter what. I'm going to look at the facts of things first, no matter what, instead of just being all emotional. I'm going to be an elevated being and not a descending being. I refuse to allow myself to repeat and retread this existence. I refuse to allow myself to only go to the next level of consciousness. No, I must go. If there are 12 levels, then I need to be up there around the 12th level, understanding that only the Creator can be at the 12th. I need to be at 11, okay? I need to be right there at 11. So we have to come to that kind of mindset, and that mindset has to recognize that all these earthly attachments that we create are simply that. They're earthly attachment. They don't mean a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, other than trying to teach us how to elevate our consciousness. And we do that with the alchemical marriage of the male and the female energy, recognizing that they both can bring life, but the male energy only has to die symbolically, but not die literally, because we still need the ego to work in concert with the emotion, with care, with nurturing, with not logic, because that's part of the ego, but we just need all that to work together. So I hope this video has been helpful to some of you guys. I know some of it's kind of thrown together because I didn't want to make this like an hour long or anything like that, but really just go and look at where the male sacrifice came from, why circumcision and everything has to do with blood and men having to die, and the fact that men are trying to die. Men have to die because they can't repeat and duplicate what the woman does with the menstrual cycle, and how the menstrual cycle works with the phases of the moon, and how the sun dies with the winter solstice and then is reborn again. When you start to look at all those clues and put them together, you start to understand why people back in the day came up with this male-centric, men gotta die kind of mentality, because in the natural life, that's the only way a man could bleed for 4 or 5 days without dying, or 3-4 days without dying, was to give his life, right? And once he's given his life, then he's reborn. Man is always, the Savior is always reborn. The Savior is always reborn, whether it's Horus or Atticus, whether it's Dionysius, Yeshua, doesn't matter. The Savior has to be reborn again. Hell, even Muhammad's coming back. So everybody got to be reborn. Every male does. Ishtar was the only female. Ishtar, and if you say, oh no, that was Inanna. Inanna and Ishtar are the same person. Okay, so just take that for what it is. I hope this has been a blessing to you guys. I hope it helps you with your understanding. I forgot who asked the question, but I hope that this answers that question for you. And let's just continue to progress in raising our kundalini, raising our female and male energy in balance with the alchemical marriage, because at the end of the day, in everything you do, you should be an alchemist. Well, if you're sweeping the floor, be an alchemist in your floor sweeping. You can be a conscious floor sweeper. If you're an executive, you can be a conscious executive. You can be a conscious parent. You can be a conscious everything, and raise your go from lead to gold. Raise your consciousness in every aspect. So y'all have a great day. Enjoy yourself, and remember, you got to free yourself to be yourself, and your greatness is non-negotiable.